Let's take a closer look at the standard templates, the standard project template for an ASP.NET Core application. Take a look at the startup class to see how all this stuff comes together. So I'll go ahead and open up that class. And first thing I want to do is just briefly point out a couple things within the constructor. So the class name is startup. So the constructor name, of course, is startup. There's a hosting environment that is injected into that startup class. And so this makes environment information available to this constructor. And then it uses this configuration builder to essentially read in different sets of settings using the configuration system within ASP.NET Core. It sets the base path, so essentially this is going to make the root path of the application the content root path, so that it doesn't have to worry too much about paths. It can just go off the root. And then it adds those JSON files, an appsettings.json, and it indicates that this file is optional, and it should reload the file on any change, so it can dynamically reload and change settings. And then what's interesting here is that you can also optionally include other appsettings.json files for different environments. So all you need to do is, if you have, say, a debug environment, then you can create a file called appsettings.debug.json. And if that file exists in the root path of the application, then this method call right here will load those settings into memory. Okay, and that also gives you the option of configuring the development environment. Earlier in the course, a couple times, I've mentioned user secrets. And so this is a way of keeping secrets, such as usernames, passwords, maybe sensitive network machine names, other things like that, secret, maybe API keys and so forth. Put those separate from the source code. They need to be available on each developer's machine, but then you can use this scheme in order to load those secrets. Maybe it's connection string, and add those to the builder so that that connection string is now available to the application. So there's a lot of things that you can do, and as the comment says, for more details, go to that link right there. And that's actually in the template file, so you always see that. Okay, and then it adds any environmental variables that are defined on the machine. So nice thing about this is it's really easy to configure a developer's machine for an application, can customize the environment, particularly if they're performing different kinds of tasks and they're looking at the application in different ways. Okay, and then they build that configuration object and assign it to the configuration property of this class. Okay, and as you can see, there's that public variable right there that's available throughout the application. Okay, so that's the constructor. Now let's start talking about those two methods that I've been talking about. So the first one is that I want to talk about is configure services right here. So now remember, the purpose for this optional method, you don't have to have it, is that it adds services to the application to make them available. As you can see, you get this service collection object that's injected into the method as a parameter. And so now you can use this in order to build on the services that are available to this application. And so the first custom service that's added here is Entity Framework Core, in fact. And so it is going to use SQL Server. In fact, this application by default uses LocalDB, which is a lightweight local form of SQL Server. And then you can see where it's using that configuration object, that's the one that was defined up here, in order to get the connection string. That's the default connection. And there, just to make the point, you can see how the app settings file works because it loaded app settings into the configuration file. And in the connection strings section here, it has this default connection that was defined that uses the local DB. And you can add additional connection strings here if you like. Okay, so because all this happened up here with app settings, that's available here to read that setting and use SQL Server and connect to that connection string. So that's how that configuration stuff works. Okay, then this particular application, because when I created it, I opt to use individual user accounts, needs to add the identity service. And it does some configuration here. It's going to use an entity framework store in order to read the data. And there's that application DB context that I talked about earlier, which is the object context for accessing that SQL server. Okay, so it's adding that identity service and configuring it. Next up is it adds MVC. This is an ASP.NET Core MVC application, so I need to use those services. Of course, I could write my own provider for MVC, and I believe there are some third-party ones out there. But generally, you're going to want to use the Microsoft implementation. And so this is an add method that takes care of adding that service and configuring it and bringing it in, making it available to the application. Okay, so this is all the fairly standard stuff that you're going to want to include in pretty much all your ASP.NET Core MVC applications, unless you have some special need to replace it. But then you can also record your own services as well, and you're probably going to use a technique similar to this right down here. So what these two lines code is that it adds some additional application services, and these are used by the account controller to manage users and logins. And I'll talk more about these when I cover dependency injection in detail, because the preview of that is that what these lines of code here are doing, the services.addTransient method calls, are defining those services to be used for dependency injection. Specifically, when I request the iEmailSender, I want to provide the concrete auth message sender class. So that's what's that doing there. But again, more about dependency injection a little bit later. Okay, so that's the configure services. Again, it's optional, but real world practicality means that you're almost always going to have it within anything that's a non-trivial application. All right, so now let's talk about this configure method.